Welcome back, everyone, for the third panel discussion of the day on governance in the Arctic. This panel will be moderated by the former EU Arctic Ambassador, Marianne Coninsx. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Niklas, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to the people listening in Canada and the US. We heard the first two panels of this Arctic Futures Symposium, which was mainly focused on 25 years of Arctic Council. This panel will be addressing Arctic governance, but it will be seen from the perspective from European Union, from the regions, from business, and from a gender perspective. And why I looked up what actually is Arctic governance. And if you Google it, most likely you will get to the notion Arctic Council. But Arctic governance is not only limited to the Arctic Council itself. And I found a very good notion of it from the German Arctic Office. And the German Arctic Office is a very serious Arctic government. They also have been managing the Mosaic expedition, the biggest expedition, Arctic expedition in the world. So, and they said, which I found very interesting, by international standards, the region, the Arctic region, has been adopting a very innovative approach to governments. And they also said that the main developments of Arctic governments over the 40 years, the last 40 years, they highlighted two things. First of all is the decentralization of authority and the growing role also of the regional governments, and increasing empowerment of indigenous people. And I think you cannot stress enough, it has been said before, but the role of the people. They also said that there are many institutions that are relevant to meeting the needs of governments in the Arctic. They mentioned the obvious one, the UN Convention for Law of the Sea, multilateral level. Think, for example, about multilateral agreements in the field of climate change. In the regional, they mentioned the Arctic Council and others, and then you have the national, the local level, and I have been adding also the level of the European Union. So I come now to my panel, and I'm extremely pleased that we have very good representatives on the different subjects. We have, I will start with my colleague and friend Michael Mann, who is, the EU Special Envoy for Arctic matters. He has been before the EU ambassador to Iceland. And I think that it's also good to mention that he had a very important personal contribution in drafting the new updated EU Arctic policy. So Michael, the question that I would like to ask you, in this EU Arctic policy, it's said that EU are pleading for more European Union in the Arctic. So my question is, do you think that the current model of Arctic governments allow for such ambition of the European Union in the Arctic? Michael, you have the floor.
No? Now it is. Good. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. My basic answer would be, I hope it's not a disappointing answer to the moderator. Basically, yes. I mean, we are not observers in the Arctic Council, but we have been granted the same rights as observers. And I had the good fortune to be with Mads in Salekhard in northern Siberia last week. And we were, I was for the first time physically observing an Arctic Council senior Arctic officials meeting. And again, we are just observing, but we also have a special session with the chair for observers. There weren't many of us actually physically there, so it was a reasonably good opportunity to push our points home. And the chair has expressed the willingness to have a sort of specific event for observers. I mean, I think the Icelandic chairmanship pushed very hard for a bigger role for observers in the Arctic Council, and I think the Russian chairmanship will hopefully follow up on that. And again, we heard that Louise saying that there should be a bigger role, sort of bigger engagement of observers in the working groups and the expert groups of the Arctic Council. That's something we've said in our new policy paper, that we want to do that. It's partly been a question of logistics really and budgets for people to actually go to Arctic Council working group meetings, but we've made the commitment now that we're going to do that. So we can contribute in the Arctic Council, but I'd like to follow up the point that you made. There's much more to Arctic governance than the Arctic Council. Barents Euro Arctic Council obviously brings together all of the Nordic countries and Russia and the European Union. It's got many different layers as well, many different levels. It's proved to be very useful. There was a ministerial not very long ago, a couple of months ago. Northern Dimension, and I think it's worth mentioning the Northern Dimension. It brings together the EU, Russia, Norway, and Iceland. And there it is a forum or a sort of framework in which we can actually, and we do actually still work with Russia. We don't have the easiest relations always with Russia on many issues, but particularly on the environment, we have been doing a lot of work, useful work with Russia along the lines of our principles that govern our relations with Russia. But this is where it's of benefit to all. We don't do it purely out of altruism. Obviously, it's partly about making sure that environmental threats that would also affect us and everyone else are got rid of. And then, you know, it's also, as you also said, it's about much more than purely Arctic or Barents fora as well. It's the question of we want to try and bring discussions on the Arctic into our bilateral discussions with, you know, not just Arctic states, but other states, because increasingly you see that countries outside of the Arctic are very interested and have an interest in making sure that things work well in the Arctic. I mean, India is making its own Arctic policy, China obviously, but even international organizations as well. There are countries that are going to disappear if Arctic climate change continues at the rate that it is now. So they would have an interest in talking to, and the groups that represent them, African Union, whoever it may be. And so, you know, there is much that we can do. And again, it's not just about talking specifically about the Arctic. As you said yourself, the Paris process, the climate action process, will have the hugest influence on what happens in the Arctic, much more than what we do in the Arctic. It's the 7.8 billion people who live south of the Arctic Circle who are causing the Arctic climate change, not the very few people who live in the Arctic, the 4 million. So again, there are international processes going on where the EU isn't just taking part, it's actually a leader, to be honest. So we can do our bit. I mean, things can always be improved, but I think we're able, through our different, both, you know, specifically Arctic and international contacts, to do quite a lot of good for the Arctic. I'm an optimistic person.
Thank you very much, Michael. I actually liked your answer.
Oh, can I go back on it a little bit?
No, I will ask you a supplementary question, but we've first finished the first round. I go now, and I hope that she will be online. Miss Ågren Wikström from Sweden. Yes, I see already she's on your screen, Nicola. There she is. Welcome, Mrs. Wikström. I hope I pronounce well your name. Mrs. Wikström is the Vice President of the Regional Development Board of the Västerbotten region in Sweden and Vice Chair of the Europa Forum, and she's also a member of the Committee of the Region. So welcome again. Ms. Wikström, you are coming from an Arctic region, a Nordic Swedish region. Now, how do you see the role of the regions in the Arctic? You have the floor.
Thank you so much, and I hope all the technology works. If not, someone will let me know, please. First of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this interesting and important symposium, I think. My name is Ågren Wikström, and you pronounced it perfectly, so well done to that. And today I represent the northern sparsely populated areas, the NSPA network, which is a network of 13 northernmost regions of Sweden, Finland, and Norway in the Arctic, Europe. Together, we are larger than Spain in size, but have fewer people than Rome, with only 4.9 inhabitants per square kilometer. So we have an extremely low population density in comparison to other regions in the EU, but in an Arctic context, we are quite urban, I'd say. We have growing cities, well-known universities, and high-tech industries that are leading the green transition. And at the same time, we have severe structural challenges such as vast distances and lack of critical mass, but that in combination with the great opportunities for sustainable development is the Arctic feature that makes our region so unique. I would like to start with taking the opportunity to acknowledge the European Commission and the European External Action Service for the close and constructive cooperation on the Arctic over the years. We appreciate the engaged role that the EU has taken to establish a close link and dialogue with the regions in the Arctic. The EU is an important actor on Arctic issues. And we welcome the updated EU Arctic policy that launched on October 13 this year. And we are especially pleased to welcome the recognition of the NSPA network as a constructive dialogue partner, together with our friends in the Arctic Mayors Forum, the Arctic Economic Council, and the Sami Council. All politics is local, meaning that we see that the regions are crucial for the realization of policies, as everything happens in a local place, in a region or a territory. From my point of view, I think successful regional development requires more place-based policies, more cross-sectorial coordination, and enhanced multi-level governance to enable growth and promote sustainable development. In times of distrust among citizens and a feeling of decisions being made far away and maybe not have a sense of being listened to, I think it's more important than ever to recognize the role of the local and regional level. And that's why we see that the EU has great potential to be a facilitator by investing in the European Arctic, and should continue to use its soft power to be a relevant partner and improving conditions for growth in the EU regions and neighboring areas. The EU has great potential to be a facilitator for the Arctic, to continue being a sustainable and thriving place, as well as a peaceful one, of course. By investing in research, collaboration, and development on a people-to-people and business-to-business basis across borders in the European Arctic, we believe that the EU will strengthen its needed legitimacy concerning the larger Arctic. I think it's crucial that the European Arctic can be an attractive place for both men and women to live in and give stability to the region and beyond. At the regional levels of government, there are great know-how of the conditions for businesses, as well as experience of strategic innovation leadership and regional development. The existing smart specialization strategies gives an analytical basis and constitutes a strategic coordination of local, regional, national, and European efforts for regional sustainable development that is characterized both by growth and diversification of the regional economies, as well as the sustainable green transition. Do what you can with what you have where you are. This is a normal state of mind for those of us who live in the northern part of Sweden. But we also recognize that you can do more if you do it together in cooperation. The EU Arctic Forum in 2019, hosted in my hometown Umeå, was an important step for the EU engagement, and we are very much looking forward to welcoming EU representatives and other stakeholders soon back again to the next forum in 2022, although we don't know where it's going to take place yet. But anyone who's interested to see and experience the green shift in our regions are, of course, welcome to visit us at any time. And with the NSPA network, we'll have our annual forum in Skellefteå, Västerbotten in March. And by the way, I think the background picture on the web for this event is actually from Skellefteå. So according to this, we're going to launch the new Interreg Aurora program, and then you're more than welcome to join. So thank you so much for now.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wikström, for this very interesting presentation. I actually had the pleasure to be at the Arctic Forum in Umeå, which was the first one, and which was really engaging with all the stakeholders. And I keep an excellent memory of that. And I like very much what you said. You can do more if you cooperate together, which does not only apply to the Arctic, I think, but this is really something cooperation is in the DNA of the European Union. Mrs. Wikström spoke also about business, so the step to the next speaker is quite easy for me. And I welcome Mats Qvist Frederiksen here, who is a director of the Arctic Economic Council. And before, you were senior advisor in the Confederation of Danish Industry, also focusing on the Arctic. So Mats, you have the floor. I need to ask you the question, but how do you see Arctic governments from a business perspective?
Thank you very much. And let me start out just because I think this is important when now we have been speaking about the Arctic Council for a lot about the governance there. The Arctic Economic Council was created by the Arctic Council, but we have very, very different setup. So one example is that we have members from Greece, from France, from South Korea, from Germany, and they have the same say as some of the other members overall in the membership group. Then we also do have more than 30% representation of indigenous groups within our organization. Most of the policy is happening from the Arctic, not from any of the capitals, but actually from the Arctic itself. And we also have the indigenous representative in our board as a part. So just to say that, and I think this is a key point, is that it has to benefit the people in the Arctic. So it has to come from the Arctic, the wishes for the development. We have to include people from outside the Arctic. We have to invite people. We're only 4 million people. We've got plenty of space for more people. And then also that we need to remember the PPs or the indigenous groups where you know they want to participate. And then I really think the AEC is set up for that. Governance is for businesses is obviously very different. If you know governance for business in Russia is very different from governance for business in the Faroe Islands. The same goes from Alaska's versus Aquariary. But one thing that is in common for a lot of companies is that the exporting companies, they need some kind of mutual framework. We already talked about the forums like the Arctic Council, the Euro Barons, the West Nordic. But then we have, you know, even more important for businesses when it comes to export is companies like, not companies, organizations like the IMO. We saw what happened with the heavy fuel oil ban has a big impact on companies in the maritime industry. We talked about the Polar Code, UNECE as well, about regulations about export, but also the EU. So the EU has an important role for companies because they are making legislation and making policy that impacts if you want to export. If you're a reindeer herder in Russia and you want to export your meat to the European market, you need to follow certain standards. No matter what the Arctic Council says, you know, that's the EU deciding these sets of standards. So the EU has a really big role as a governance for businesses. I think a good example is Greenland. Last week, they announced that they're going to transfer. So I will give you a very short crash course to Kingdom of Denmark policy. So there's a lot of things that they can do legislation about, and some legislation happens from Denmark, from Copenhagen. And the government can decide to take home or transfer home some legislation. And they decided last week that they want to transfer home their accounting. So everything, all legal rules around accounting, they will bring home to Greenland and they will make the rules themselves instead of getting the laws from Copenhagen. What is interesting is that the minister for this area, Pelle Broberg, he said, but they will still copy paste the Danish legislation. And the reasons for that is because the Danish legislation is set up for the EU. So even though that Greenland is a non-EU state, they're still going to copy paste the Danish legislation around accounting because the Greenlandic company trades with the EU. So they need to follow certain standards. Another example where it kind of goes the other way around is, and I think this is an interesting example, is that we all know about the sanctions between Russia, EU, the US, and Russia also has sanctions against the EU. We quite often forget that around food. So food cannot be exported, or there's a lot of restrictions for food export from the EU into Russia. The only exceptions here is the Faroe Islands and Greenland. They're actually exporting a lot of fish to Russia. So here they are benefiting from not being a part of the EU governance. And this just shows that, you know, governance has a big issue for companies, and companies will go where the governance structures are the most feasible and the best possible. I think I just want to briefly speak about how governance also can push, you know, the directions of where we want to go, and especially when it comes to the EU. So we have the overseas countries and territories, the OCT. They contribute with a lot of funding to the Greenlandic educational sector. This year was decided that 10% of these money that goes each year has to go to the green growth, the green agenda. That's really an example of the EU governance playing a role in where you want the Arctic to go. You want the Arctic to be more green, and you're actually allocating money for this green growth. And I think this is a great example, and this definitely offers a lot of opportunities for companies suddenly that the EU enters the stage. Just because I don't want this to just be another one of those panels where everyone sits and smiles and agrees. So let me try to stir up Michael before I move on. The EU came up with the policy or the communication. There's some good parts in this. There's renewable energy, a focus on that. There's the focus on mining. I think that's very, very positive. The EU is taking a step and says, you know, we need those critical rare earth and everything else, raw materials, and connectivity. We already talked about this. But there's also, when it comes to governance, there's the power of language. You know, we have to remember that. So when the EU decides to make a conscious decision to call for oil and gas to stay in the ground in an EU Arctic communication, that sends a strong signal. So the messaging from the EU has been that, but this is a general opinion. We believe this from everywhere, you know. But when I look through the policies for, you know, when the EU meets with the US or with China or with anyone else, they don't mention oil and gas should stay in the ground. There's a conscious decision to mention this in the Arctic policy. And this, here we come down to the power of language. You know, that sends a signal that the Arctic is some kind of different when it comes to this, that we rather have oil from Mozambique than from northern Norway. Apparently that's some kind of more responsible, and I think that's wrong. You know, I think it scares away investors, and the EU has an important role here to be careful of where. I mean, yes, the EU has an energy policy, but let's separate that from the Arctic policy. So to summarize, I think the governance here is for the EU when it comes to business is to speak about the solution, speak the Arctic region up as a place of solutions. We already heard all the other speakers saying that as well. Speak about how can we benefit the people. You know, so Norway, Russia, the US, a lot of the companies there were against the EU policy. Let's try to actually meet them where they have an interest, and then speak about the good cases from the region. I think the EU has a role there. You know, we just heard from Sweden. They are building one of the most important battery plants for electric vehicles is being constructed in Sweden. I think that's a great case, and I think we should talk more about this. 25% of the batteries needed in the future will come from northern Sweden in the Arctic. So let's talk about that, and I think the EU has a role there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mats. Indeed, very interesting. And I will maybe, when we have had our round of questions, I will have Michael reply. But it's no coincidence that we put the two of you together at the same desk.
We'll try not to fight physically.
Sorry. So thank you very much. And I go to the next speaker, Mrs. Embla Oddsdottir. You have her on already on the, she will be joining us. She's from Iceland. Embla, hello, Embla, very nice to see you. Embla is director of the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network. Embla has a lot of functions, important ones. Is also very active in the Arctic Council, social, economic and cultural expert group. But we especially invited her today here because Embla is also leading the gender equality in the Arctic. And I think that it's not so often spoken about at conferences, but gender is extremely important, not only in the Arctic context, but also elsewhere. And particularly because we are here at the Arctic Futures Symposium, where we already spoke in previous panels about youth. I think gender is also key important. So Embla, thank you again for participating. And I would like to ask you, how do you see Arctic governments from a gender perspective? Embla, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this important event. It's an honor to contribute to the Arctic Futures Symposium, and it's my pleasure to be here today to discuss gender and governance in the Arctic. This is a topic that's not only close to my heart, but also highly relevant and thankfully is now moving higher up on the agenda in the region. Although you are completely correct, Marianne, we too seldom hear a discussion on gender. The way that the topic of gender is moving up on the agenda in the region has been evident through our work on the Pan-Arctic report on gender equality in the Arctic. This is a part of the Arctic Council Sustainable Development Working Group project on gender and has been ongoing since 2013. It was a chairmanship project during the Icelandic chairmanship of the Council in 2019 with 2020 to 2021, with leads and co-leads including Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Canada, the United States, the Sami Council, and the Aleut International Association. But as it is a highly collaborative project, it includes many other additional partners, which we do not unfortunately have time to go into today. The report itself provides almost 70 policy relevant highlights, which are relevant for multiple audiences, including Arctic states, the Council and its working groups, policymakers, private industry, the research community, and the public. Broadly speaking, the most prominent findings were the need for mainstreaming and gender-based analysis, better gender and sex disaggregated data, inclusive terminology and intersectionality, and the recommendation the report provided specifically for the Arctic Council speak to these. It's recommended that the Council systematically engages with a mainstream gender-based analysis across its work, setting an example at national and regional levels. But it's also recommended that the Council encourage and facilitate the development of guidelines for consistent and comparable data throughout the Arctic. The report was welcomed by the Arctic Council Ministerial in May 2021 and included in the Reykjavik Declaration in 2021, as well as the topic of gender being included in the first Arctic Council Strategic Plan. We're very pleased with this development and view this as a clear sign of the support this topic is receiving from the Council. This was also evident in the support the project received in terms of funding, which was received from Iceland, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, the government of the Faroe Islands, the Crown Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and the National Science Foundation and US Department. Additionally, support was provided by the Nordic Council of Ministers, the Icelandic Gender Equality Fund, the Prime Minister's Office in Iceland, the Directorate of Equality, and the Stefánsson Arctic Institute. And co-sponsorship included additional important institutions such as the Polar Institute and Wilson Center, Dartmouth College, and the UArctic. We see this commitment to the project as reflecting an understanding of the importance of gender in the Arctic region and its sustainable development. We are also particularly grateful and pleased to see that in its newly released policy in the Arctic, the EU recognizes that sustainable development is not possible without gender equality, and that the EU will work to ensure that women's voices are heard in drawing up policies applicable to the Arctic, as well as providing funding for young people and women. You will see from the report, when you've read the whole thing, that there is still considerable work ahead in reducing inequalities, not only in terms of gender, but in a broader understanding of systemic and persistent inequalities, for instance, in terms of indigenous and non-indigenous populations. There are just a couple of things that I would, with your permission, Chair, like to flag here today. Arctic governance does not prioritize gender equality, and the goal of gender equality is not fulfilled within the region. We need to actively bring gender perspectives into discussions, applied planning and policy surrounding industry and development in the Arctic. Gender-based violence continues to be of great concern throughout the Arctic. Women are overrepresented as victims of violent crimes, and indigenous women and girls face disproportionate violent victimization. We need to address systemic inequalities on multiple levels, whether it be on the gendered, central, periphery, or indigenous, non-indigenous nexus. There are continual patterns of gender-related clustering in government institutions and businesses, where men are overrepresented in governance and management in the most vital economic sectors. Mainstreaming gender equality and empowerment at national, regional, and local levels plays an important role in attaining gender empowerment in the political, economic, and civic spheres. The bottom line is that diversity at higher levels of policy and decision-making bodies, as well as in management in the political, economic, and academic sphere, is instrumental in not only achieving gender equality, but also in moving towards sustainable policy making in the region. I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Embla, for a presentation which is a lot an eye-opener, I would say, on the issue, and the problems are known, recommendations are known, but there is still a big lack in the implementation, the effective implementation of these recommendations and policies. So still a long way to go. My last speaker of this panel, last but not least, is Francesco Bertoldi, who is the head of the Nordic and the Arctic Department of the Scottish government. As his name says, he's from Italian origin. He's a real Scot now. And Francesco, welcome. Scotland, and those particularly who knows, for example, the Arctic Circle Assembly, know that beside, I think there are two regions, nations, which are always very present at Arctic Circle Assemblies, is Greenland, but also Scotland. Scotland is very active on the file, and Scotland has an Arctic policy framework. And for those who haven't read them, I recommend it strongly. It's the most refreshing Arctic policy you will be able to read. So, Francesco, welcome again, and I would like to ask you about how do you see Arctic governments from a regional point of view, notably from the point of view of a non-Arctic nation, but that is most active on the file. Francesco, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Marianne, for that lovely and very generous introduction. We know we can count on you as one of our supporters, and that is by no means a small thing. Listen, I know that some people in the audience, especially those who are less familiar with Scottish Arctic connections, they would be absolutely forgiven for looking on me as a bit of an outsider on this panel. Scotland is not an Arctic nation, nor, sadly, let me underline, are we in the European Union any longer. So I thought I would use these initial remarks to set out why the Scottish government is investing in greater Scottish Arctic collaboration, and more broadly, why Scotland is increasingly looking north. So I said that Scotland is not in the Arctic, and that is absolutely a fact. What is also a fact, though, is that Scotland is the most northerly non-Arctic nation. Our Shetland archipelago lies as far north as Cape Farewell in Greenland or Juneau in Alaska, for instance. Maybe that in itself can start shifting some perceptions of where Scotland is in the world. From an Arctic perspective, we are quite close, and we can also be seen as central. We could work as a bridge between the European Arctic and Central Europe, or also between North American and European Arctic from a trade and economic perspective as well. However, what I would immediately add is that Scottish Arctic links go well beyond mere geographical proximity. We have long-standing and very deep cultural, historical, economic, and linguistic links, too many to mention, really. But what really lies at the heart, at the core of modern-day Scottish Arctic collaboration is, I believe, an appreciation of how similar our challenges are. And there is a set of figures that I often use to give a sense of what these challenges are all about. And what I'm about to say reminds very closely, and is not coincidence, to what Asa said in relation to the NSPA network. Scotland has 96 inhabited islands, whose population is often in the single digits. We have 98% of our landmass is classified as rural, but it contains only 17% of our population. Some regions in Scotland, I'm thinking surely of the Highlands, but also in the south and the borders, well, they are among the least densely populated parts of Europe. So while admittedly the scale of our rurality, of our low population density is different if compared to the Arctic average, some challenges are similar, if not the same. I would like to draw your attention here. You mentioned the Arctic Circle Assembly, Marianne. What our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, said at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October is that Scotland's commitment to and work with the Arctic is not a diplomatic nicety. It is a practical policy necessity. We have similar challenges, so we want to exchange knowledge, expertise, and best practices to come up together with joint solutions to those common challenges. And it is for this reason that we publish our Arctic Connections policy framework in September 2019. We feel that Scotland has a lot of relevant expertise to share. I'm thinking, for instance, of our higher education provision, or of our expertise in relation to renewable energies, of course, of our marine planning and marine science experience. Together with Arctic countries and Arctic partners, we can tackle challenges that have to do with rural depopulation, with connectivity, with the decarbonization of our transport and energy provision. Of course, we can work together also on the shared climate emergency that we discuss at length here in Scotland for COP26 in Glasgow. So we feel we have a lot to share, and it is in that spirit that we responded to the public consultation that Michael and his team promoted last year to inform the new EU Arctic policy, which we, of course, welcome. While we say that we have a lot to share, a lot to contribute to Arctic discussions, we don't shy away from acknowledging that there is still a lot that we have to learn. And we can learn from communities, regions, and countries that are facing and tackling similar issues. So my team and I are now busy implementing the commitments that we made in the Arctic Policy Framework, which I absolutely recommend to all of you. And what we have seen in recent years is a further increase in Scottish Arctic collaboration. And that is particularly rewarding because we were already starting from quite a high baseline. For instance, even in the current iteration, 40% of the projects that are supported through the EU Northern Periphery and Arctic Programme have at least one Scottish partner. So through this work and through what I've set out during this brief presentation, we hope to show that while Scotland may be perceived as an outsider, we believe we are a close, committed, and also we hope a valuable one. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. And it's very clear that Scotland cannot be seen as an outsider on this topic, and that Scotland indeed has a lot to offer, which is all very clearly explained in its policy on the basis of extremely concrete examples. So again, I recommend reading the Scottish policy, Arctic framework policy. I come now to the second round of the questions, and I just want to inform you that at the end of our panel discussion, we will also have an intervention of the ICC chair, Ms. Dali Doro, who was not able to be present at the previous panel, but she will come in at the end of this panel also to make some comments. And I'm extremely pleased that she's able to do this also as a representative of the permanent participants. So Michael, I come to the second round of questions, and I will give you also the possibility, if you would like, to reply to Matt's provocative comments. But my question is also a little bit provocative, Michael, but I'm sure you don't mind. You said, and I followed via Twitter, all the activities of the Arctic Council meeting, the senior Arctic officials, which took place in Siberia. So you had your physical experience of your Arctic senior Arctic official meeting. And based on my experience, and I guess it has not been much different in your case, is that the observers are during 2 days sitting on the back benches, listening to the Arctic Council. You might have had a separate meeting with the Arctic Council chair. And you heard also at the previous discussions, panels on the Arctic Council, where it said, yes, the observers in favor of the observers' engagement, with 2 specific examples given: the fact that they can participate in the working groups with their expertise, and of course, also if they can contribute in financing the projects. And the EU is doing both, and working in the working groups expertise and financing, particularly the black carbon project. But do you think can you call this an kind of being inclusive? Do you think that still of this time, where the engagement of Arctic observers is really the real engagement, where they could have a voice, is this still feasible and maintainable in future? Is this an inclusive Arctic Council? Question mark?
Well, I mean, as we say in our Arctic policy, obviously the 8 Arctic states have the first say. They have the primary responsibility of what happens on their territory. So being an observer to the Arctic Council, well, not strictly speaking an observer, but a de facto observer, is what it says on the tin. You know, I mean, we observe. And we accept that, I think. I mean, our starting point is that the EU is in the Arctic. We have member states with 3 member states with territories in the Arctic, one of which calls itself an Arctic state in 100%. And therefore we have a role to play, but we can play our role through the Arctic Council via our member states. And okay, it's probably sounds disappointing that we're appreciated only for our expertise and our money, but we're still appreciated. I mean, we have a lot of scientific expertise that is brought to bear in the Arctic Council, and we want to increase that. So I wouldn't say that we're, broken-hearted that we're not more included. I think it's just the nature of the beast. It's an intergovernmental organization that was set up by the Arctic states. We can play our role, and as I said in answer to my first question, we can play a major role in other ways, whether it be through our bilateral contacts with our close friends, the United States, Canada, Norway, Iceland, etc., or whether it be going beyond that, or our frankly, leading role in some of the UN processes, biodiversity process, climate change process. So, you know, we can cry and say that we'd like to be more included, but I don't think that would change anything, frankly. And we have our ways of doing our business. And I'd like to, before I bash Mads, I'd like to pay tribute to him for doing a much better job than me of promoting the role that we do actually have by making laws for the Arctic. And it applies not just in our 3 member states, but to a certain extent in the 2 other countries as well, Norway and Iceland. On Mads's point about our oil, gas and coal moratorium proposal, it's an Arctic policy document, but it does say in the first mention of this that oil, coal and gas should stay in the ground, including in the Arctic. So it is a sort of global hope, aspiration that we have. But it being a Arctic specific document, we then go on to say that we would like to negotiate with our partners a moratorium on further exploration in Arctic waters. So it has a specific Arctic reference, but it also has a more general reference. And it may not be findable in other policy documents, but maybe we can kind of be very pleased with ourselves in the Arctic team that we were the sort of trailblazers here. And this is, you know, a commitment that we will make around the world. We all know, as was said by the International Energy Agency, that if we're serious about 1.5 degrees, if we're serious about our Paris commitments, oil, coal and gas, you know, has to be phased out. And where, you know, perhaps we were using a bit of a blunt instrument with hindsight, putting oil, gas and coal in the same sentence, because I think there are, you know, these things have to happen at a different speed. But COP26 kind of sounded the death knell of coal, I think. And we're aware, as our Norwegian friends never hesitate to remind us, that gas is an important transition fuel, obviously, for the energy transition. But the fact that this issue was the big issue in the Norwegian general election shows that I think the tide has turned a little bit. And we're not naive either. We know that we don't grant licenses for gas, coal and oil. And it's not, strictly speaking, a legal competence of ours. But, you know, as my much more learned colleague said, that people have got 3 choices. They can either ignore us, or they can get cross, or they can enter into a real meaningful conversation about this. And it's a conversation that has to be had. And I think it will be had, and we will try and bring it up at every level in the future, whether it be our political masters or myself or my colleagues. And hopefully in 5 years' time, we'll be wondering why we even had this conversation. It should just be natural, because if we're serious about halting climate change, and specifically Arctic climate change, then we have to have this conversation. It has to lead to an energy transition. We need, and we were also criticized for being inconsistent in calling for a moratorium on hydrocarbons whilst promoting mining for minerals. And we're aware that mining for minerals has a lot of particularly social and economic issues for indigenous peoples. We're aware of the concern that they have, but we therefore made a point of underlining that this has to be done to the very strictest environmental but also social standards, with a lot of consultation. But we really need to have more autonomy. We can't be reliant on the likes of China for these minerals that will be necessary if we're going to have this transformation. So we need 2 transformations: away from hydrocarbons towards carbon neutral energy, which relies upon these minerals. And it's not going to happen overnight, but we, rather polishing our halos, we like to be in the vanguard of this, and we like to be driving this process. And I think, if for us to be credible to our global leadership on climate change, we had to make this statement, and hopefully this will be followed up in other regional papers. It just happens to have happened first in our Arctic policy. So there you are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And in case, Matt, you would like to reply on that, maybe we first go to the next speaker. Supplementary question to Mrs. Wikström. She's again on the screen. Yes. Mrs. Wikström, on the basis of what you said, how do you see the next steps, and and which role your region can play in this regard?
Well, thank you for that. First, let me echo on Embla. I think the gender equality issue is so crucial, and very, very important issue for the whole region. I see when we are able to create attractive places that girls and women see their future in and want to build their careers, somehow the boys tend to follow. So I think this is an important thing for our entire region, to make attractive places for women and girls to really want to live in. And so this is my first echo to Embla. And thank you for the other speakers as well. I think the debate on climate, natural resources and sustainable development in the light of growing geopolitical interest need to continue to be addressed by the highest EU level, of course, with a continued inclusive process that engages all relevant stakeholders. From our NSPA network, we are prepared to continue to be a constructive and engaged partner that can deliver regional perspectives on how to develop the Arctic in a sustainable way. And we hope that the EU will continue to listen to, believe in, and of course, invest in the European Arctic as a gateway to the larger Arctic and ultimately contribute to global sustainable development. We see now in both Sweden, as Mats just mentioned, the forming of the Nordic battery belt alongside Vasa in Finland and Mo i Rana in Norway. So we have this Nordic battery belt forming now to be able to stand for the future, I'd say, and all our future needs that we're going to have in terms of the green transition in the industry. It's happening a lot of making steel in a new way without coal in Norrbotten, in the north of Sweden also. So it's tons of things happening. And I think we all want future generations to be able to look back and see what we did our best anyway to take care of our planet and in a safe and sustainable way. And to be able to do that, you need both the men and the women to do this alongside. So I think it's happening a lot now, but this we need to talk plenty more about, I think. So I stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Wikström. Mats, Mrs. Wikström spoke also about more investing in the Arctic. From a business perspective, how do you think the EU could do a better job in stimulating investment? Because the EU itself does not take investment decision, but how it can stimulate investments in the Arctic.
Thank you. I mean, the EU still has a role. I mean, the EU member states has a role to play in the European Investment Bank. And the European Investment Bank is also doing investments in green technologies and doing investments in mining projects, also in Greenland, actually. So there's some money following, but I really would hate this to turn into a discourse and analysis, but there is still, something about the statements and the wording you decide to use. I think, let me give you an example. So when we sit in these panels, Mike Frager in the introduction, when he spoke about the priorities, he mentioned the 5 priorities of the Arctic Research Commission. The first 2 he mentioned is Arctic infrastructure and resources. And then he mentioned, environment, health, so on. That sends a strong signal, I think, also to outsiders. If you look in the Arctic communication, if you look through, page 3, strategic foresight, page 5, security challenges, page 7, climate change, and you keep scrolling, and then you get to page 13, one of the last pages, and it says prioritizing people living in the Arctic. I will love that flipped around. That we know that globally, we know there's climate change. We have already heard that the Arctic is being hit very, very hard. And I would love the EU to be like trailblazers. You mentioned you're very proud that you closed the biggest industry for jobs and wealth in the region. And I would love the EU to be trailblazers when it comes to solutions, to look up north and says, we are prioritizing the people living in the Arctic, male and female, to link it with the other ones. And the Arctic region has a lot of solutions. So the EU has a role to play in the way they talk about the region. I think it's changing. I can feel the discourse is changing. I think the first 4 presentations we had today had a very strong focus on maritime, on tourism, on infrastructures. We heard about the infrastructure and jobs bill in the US. So I sense there's a change. I also sense that's from the EU. Let me say that. I think maybe if they could go back, I'm sure they will maybe restructure their policy, still say the same, but restructuring it differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Mats. I would like to react on that point.
Yes.
When you look at the new policy and compare it with the policy, the previous policy of 2016, which was also a very clear policy. But when we had a public consultation on what actually is lacking in the EU Arctic policy, there were some proposals, for example, saying yes, should be more focus on youth and gender and everything. But a general comment which was made, and which I personally think is extremely important, that the European Union is a geopolitical power. And if you look at developments in the Arctic, you have the implications of the warming up of the Arctic are not only climate change environment, but are particularly geoeconomics, geopolitics. And there I think one of the, if I have to speak, it's not anymore my job, it's Michael's job, but if I have to speak about the new EU Arctic policy, I will highlight the fact and welcome very much that also geopolitics is taking into account, because the objective as the EU is to contribute to peace, security, prosperity in the Arctic itself, and to keep it as an area of low tension. And there I think that it's absolutely, to my mind, it's a key element. It does not mean, because it's on page 13, that it's a lesser priority for the EU than others, because even in the previous, economic aspect was addressed, but not so strong as in the current one. And I think what Michael said, particularly natural resources, mining, and linked with the strategic economic autonomy that the EU wants to play, I think that it's a quite balanced policy. But I'm not very objective about it, I would say. A next question, a supplementary question to Embla. Embla, could you please elaborate more why diversity is so important in decision and policy making processes? Embla?
Thank you, Chair. Well, maybe the simplest way to do it is to compare it to biodiversity. I mean, we all recognize that biodiversity is critically important for many reasons. But it provides food, it helps us fight disease, it benefits businesses and the economy, provides livelihoods and protect us. So we all basically agree on that by now. The same argument could be applied to cultural diversity in general, and in the context of today's discussion, gender. It provides human resources that can boost creativity, productivity, and innovation. It can foster decreased discrimination. It can provide a balance to polarizing discourses, provide perspectives drawn from experiential realities. It's an important condition for effective democracy and good governance, contributing to improved living conditions. And increased diversity of viewpoints in policy-making institutions and those that impact policy in general have proved to lead to better decisions. So those are a few examples of why diversity makes a difference.
Thank you very much, Embla. And my question to Francesco, supplementary question. Francesco, the Scottish Arctic Cooperation is very much about human connections, and it's addressing youth, students, education as an important task and objectives. Can you maybe say a little bit more about the Scottish actions in this field, particularly, I would say, education connections?
Yeah, thank you very much, Marianne. That is a very important and very relevant question. Listen, there is no doubt that higher education and research have long been among the most promising and fruitful sources of Scottish Arctic collaboration. Scotland has a long tradition of Arctic research, especially in what I would define as the more traditional fields, such as glaciology and marine science. For instance, Scotland is home to Europe's largest glaciology research group, and it was mindful of that expertise that the Scottish government supported the Cryosphere Pavilion at COP26. It was a way to encourage a discussion between Scottish and international experts in relation to sea level rise and ice loss. I mentioned our 96 inhabited islands earlier. So the changes that are taking place in the Arctic, which are illustrative of the climate emergency, have some direct immediate impact on our communities. So it is important for Scotland to contribute as much as we can in terms of research to address those issues. What we have, however, witnessed over recent years is an expansion of Scottish Arctic research collaborations beyond those traditional quarters I mentioned earlier. So we are seeing more and more collaboration in relation, for instance, to the space industry, the principle of climate justice and a just transition away from fossil fuels. So we can perhaps find somebody who can provide counseling between Mads and Michael here in Scotland. We are doing more and more in relation to community level energy solutions and also the promotion and protection of indigenous languages. It is important for me to underline here that Scotland is a proud multilingual nation. Of course, English is the main language, but Gaelic and Scots are also spoken here in Scotland. So it is important for us to work, for instance, with Inuit and Sami communities to see how we can promote and protect indigenous languages that may be a bit under pressure, and I'm delighted that Dali will may mention that later. So just to give you a sense of the momentum that we are seeing here in Scotland, when we published our Arctic Policy Framework in September 2019, we had 2 Scottish members of the University of the Arctic, a network that I presume many of the people who are joining us today are familiar with. Well, 2 years after, we now have 7 members, which is as many as Sweden and more than any other non-Arctic nation with the exception of China. So I think that tells a story of this desire, appetite for greater Scottish Arctic knowledge exchange. And I'll just conclude by saying that as well as high quality research and collaboration with the Arctic, what Scotland can offer is also a structure or expertise in terms of delivering high quality higher education in rural and remote areas. I'm thinking of the University of the Highlands and Islands, which has a multi-campus structure with bases across the region, for instance, yes, in Inverness, but also in Shetland, in Orkney, in the Western Isles, that allows them to provide higher education, and they also tailor their provision according to the needs of the communities and the industries, the economy of each part of the Highlands and Islands. So I believe that that is another area that is very interesting from a Scottish Arctic perspective, and probably one we should do more around.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Francesco. I think that the examples you mentioned, the links with you, Arctic and wind remote regions in Scotland, digital education has become, it's not only important in the Arctic, but particularly in the world we are living now, where COVID has becoming even more relevant and important. I have we have 15 minutes left and we have one question online. But before going to the questions to the public and online, I would like to give the floor to the ICC chair, Ms. Dala Doro. ICC stands for Inuit Circumpolar Council. As I said, I'm very pleased that we also have somebody from the representatives from the Inuit, from the indigenous people here. So if Mrs. Dor she is there? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very pleased that you made it. Welcome, and I give you the floor.
Thank you so much. First of all, my apologies to Romain and the other colleagues in the panel that I didn't attend earlier. There was some confusion and it was generated all on my part. So my apologies, and thank you for accommodating me for just a few comments related to the overarching questions that were set originally for the initial panel earlier today. And they focus specifically on whether or not we have seen change in terms of Arctic governance from the Inuit Circumpolar Council perspective, and also what we see and have identified as the present challenges for the Inuit Circumpolar Council as Arctic Indigenous peoples. And I really welcome the discussion that we've just now had in terms of the human connections and the diversity within the Arctic region. And it's interesting that Francesco made a reference to their co-hosting of the Cryosphere Pavilion within COP26. And in fact, indeed, the Inuit Circumpolar Council occupied the Cryosphere Pavilion to great effect, actually. And the engagement that we had at COP26 was significant for a host of different reasons. But going back to this topic of the human connection, the Arctic is our homeland, and for thousands of years, we've nurtured reciprocal, symbiotic, and respectful relationships between our people and the Arctic environment. And I think that this is significant in terms of the change that we have seen as the Inuit Circumpolar Council, that there is a greater embrace of the human connection, a greater responsiveness to Indigenous peoples, a greater responsiveness to Inuit in particular. If you take a circumpolar view of the world, our traditional territory covers nearly half of the Arctic throughout Jakarta and the Russian Far East, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. We presently number 180,000 Inuit across our traditional homelands. And this in and of itself is significant, that we, rather than disappearing, which I think many thought would take place, we've been incrementally growing in numbers. So I think that this human connection and the fact that there is more responsiveness to Inuit, more responsiveness to Arctic Indigenous peoples, that this in and of itself is a change. I have to say that our priorities and our objectives have remained constant. And what we've seen is that everything else around us is changing. The original objectives and priorities of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, dating as far back as the mid-1970s, has remained the same. Indeed, I think it is safe to say that the Inuit Circumpolar Council was the first to call for the need for a coherent and coordinated Arctic policy. Now we see nations and institutions across the globe moving to establish their own Arctic policies, moving to establish their own agenda for the Arctic region, where in fact, again, our objectives have remained constant. And one of the crucial elements of our objectives is the fact that we should play a direct role, because not only of our rights and responsibilities to future generations, but this is our homeland. This is the environment that we have ingeniously adapted to. And in large part because of this, we have much to contribute in terms of the accumulated knowledge that we have generated over centuries about the unique conditions within this area. And when I say we've remained constant, I need to underscore that many of the other conditions have remained constant. The ICC was organized in the midst of the Cold War, and we're now seeing a revisit of some of these issues as far as defense and security issues are concerned. The infrastructure deficit, the chronic infrastructure deficit that we have faced, that unfortunately has remained constant. And I don't think that we've seen any major improvement of it, with the exception of it's now on the agenda. We've already heard this morning that infrastructure and the needs throughout the Arctic, which are important in every area, research, health and welfare, even economic development. This infrastructure deficit has to be addressed, and it has to take into account the perspectives of Inuit and other Arctic indigenous peoples. There's no question that the environment is changing, and these issues have intensified to the extent that the whole world community has to be responsive. And I think that in my assessment of COP26, not enough was done on the part of governments in terms of refreshing their commitments to real concrete actions and efforts to curb and end the warming that is taking place. And our people out there on the coastal seas, dependent on the sea ice, are seeing the dramatic changes in short periods of time, almost at a rate too rapid to adapt to. And we are proud of the adaptation that we've been able to demonstrate, especially in the Arctic region. And again, the knowledge that we have is significant, and we have much to contribute in terms of the science and moving forward. And I suppose to link that to the change that we've seen as far as a greater embrace of Indigenous peoples, that this too has to change. It is significant that we were one of the original permanent participants of the Arctic Council, but we still face challenges in terms of how do we effectively and meaningfully participate in the work of the Arctic Council, especially in the face of the increasing pressures. Turning just to a couple of challenges, I think that it's clear that our emergence in the context of the Cold War, that we're beginning to see increased geopolitical and increased geostrategic interest in the region by others far from the region. And we cannot overlook these extraordinary forces that are unfortunately beyond our full control. Yet at the same time, we need to have a measure of control, because again, it's our homeland. This is where our communities are. This is the environment that we've adapted to and that we rely upon. And so if you think about the Arctic and this backdrop of the increased geopolitical and geostrategic role that the Arctic is playing, accommodation of the voices and the concerns and the rights of Inuit have to be an element of moving forward. Another challenge is the increasing venues. I mean, there's a plethora of intergovernmental dialogues where the Arctic is important, and it's very difficult for an organization, an Indigenous peoples organization, to keep the pace up in terms of responding to the increasing number of venues and topical issues, thematic issues. The increased research alone is extraordinary. So though this is a challenge, I still insist that there's a need that we play a role. It's just a matter of us having the resources to do so and prioritizing the issues. I think it's also important to comment on the significance of the international legal order and the international norms. We are being met with a desire to alter the international legal order, to alter the international legal norms that have been established globally. UNCLOS, for example, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Too often states are looking at issues of UNCLOS in terms of navigation or the increase or the security of the real estate of nation states, and are beginning to forget all the other important chapters of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, like protection of the marine environment, Article 234 of UNCLOS. I mean, the fact that we should be looking at all of these issues in an interrelated, interdependent fashion is crucial and important. And on that note, in terms of the international legal norms and the international legal order within the Arctic region, one of the pillars of the international legal order is human rights and the recognition of and respect for human rights. And so I'm pleased to note the extraordinary comments that have been made about the human connection. We have to remember that human rights are a part of the international legal order, but even more significantly, specific progressive development has taken place in the context of Indigenous peoples. And it's my view that instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the ILO Convention number 169, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples have to be taken into account as we move forward in terms of all of these discussions. And in the end, it means the real engagement of Inuit and other Arctic Indigenous peoples in all of the economic, social, and cultural, national security and defense issues, that the whole range of issues that are up for discussion within the Arctic region. And ultimately, the need for coherence and coordination on the basis of thematic issues, for example. And the marine environment and oceans, the Arctic Ocean is just one example. You have so many different fora where Arctic Ocean and coastal seas issues arise, whether it's the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, the International Maritime Organization and the Polar Code, the relevant elements of the UNFCCC. I mean, I think it's not lost on anyone that how all of these issues are impacting the Arctic marine environment are significant, but there's no coordination or coherence of these issues. Another final challenge is what has been alluded to here, that balance of economic development activities and the need for us to really take into account the full and layperson definition of sustainable development as far as the Arctic is concerned, because we ourselves as Inuit want our communities to thrive as well and have access to the broadband, access to housing and other basic infrastructure, drinking water, sanitation services, you know, the need for the ports that would allow all Arctic nations to be responsive to the objectives of the Polar Code, for example. I mean, all of these are needs, and we also want to benefit in terms of improving the quality of life for our communities. And ultimately, in the end of the day, in my view, respecting and recognizing our human rights, both individual and collectively, meaning that we should be able to have the intellectual and political space within all of these dialogues at the international level to ensure that they are indeed responsive to Inuit and Indigenous peoples throughout the Arctic region. So apologies for a disjointed set of remarks, but again, thank you for the opportunity to raise some of these concerns, and I look forward to the remainder of this panel.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Doro, for this very inspiring, important intervention and focusing on human connections and recalling the importance of real engagement of Indigenous people, which actually is engagement on the Arctic, which is their homeland. Now, I see that we have 0 minutes left, actually, for having still questions, and I will be looking to Nicholas. How do you want to? I know we had one unexpected additional speaker, so maybe we have some flexibility.
We have a bit of flexibility. We have one question that came in that I would like to share with the panelists. Let me read it to you. It's as follows. It comes from Laura Luca, and she says the following: the EU has a new communication titled Global Gateway, offering an alternative model of investment and credit banking, particularly in infrastructure, so an alternative to China's Belt and Road initiatives. So the question is, do you see this as applicable and viable in the Arctic? And could the AEC present and leverage opportunities that would fall under this new EU initiative?
Let me be completely candid. I haven't read the document, I'll confess, which I should perhaps not admit. But I mean, we have already a commitment in our Arctic policy towards physical connectivity as well as digital connectivity in the Arctic, and you know, I think the Global Gateway basically is a more global approach to connectivity. Everyone's saying it's our kind of response to the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, it's not necessarily a response. It's a European approach, and yes, hopefully it will apply globally. And what part of the world can you think of that needs better connectivity than the Arctic? And yes, so hopefully.
Thank you, Marco.
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. I thought that you and Matt still wanted very briefly to react.
There was a second part of the questions. If we have any, investments opportunities, as I hear it, and we are coming out in January with a document with 25 sustainable investment opportunities in the Arctic. So it's from Alaska over Greenland to Russia. So this is a very good place to start with the Global Gateways, is to start with this document. But I just want to say, first of all, any investments in the Arctic is good, and we're really trying our best to attract it, whether it comes from China or the US or the EU. And everyone should have an interest in that, investments in the Arctic. But I just very, very briefly just wants to support what Embla and OSA has been saying as well about the diversity and the genders. And for me, it's very much about skills and competences. That's number one, is the one thing we have in common across the Arctic. When I ask all of my members from all the companies, from all sectors, the one main challenge is, of course, investments, but the mainly is jobs, people. Do we have enough people in the region? So just to follow up, genders is very important, diversity is super important, and we need to get more people into the region.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to the end, Niklas, of this first day of Arctic Future Symposium and the end of this panel. I must say that I'm really impressed, and I enjoyed very much all the presentations which has been made and the excellent also the discussions. And I sincerely would like to thank all the panelists here present and those who have been joining us digitally. And I hand over now to Nicholas.
Yeah, thank you. So I think we had a very thoughtful day, a lot of comments, a lot of insights on and debates on the Arctic governance, on the importance of collaboration, on also what was said at the end and reminded at the end, the importance of human connection. So I would like to thank everybody for the presence online or offline. Tomorrow we have a second day starting at 1:30. We hope still to meet you all online. Tomorrow the three main topics are youth and demographics, resilience, and sustainable business and development in the Arctic region. Before I really close this session, I would just to remind everybody that it's December 6th. December 6th, for those who are not familiar to Belgian tradition, it's Saint Nicolai, it's something like Santa Claus. So we thought it would be nice, despite some restrictions related to COVID, to invite you all for a drink downstairs for those who have the opportunity. Should we not have the opportunity to see you downstairs, I hope to meet you tomorrow for a second day. Thank you very much.